Well, and that's a helpful question because that's where I was going to begin, was in saying the important lesson from last time is that abstraction is a process of introducing new vocabulary. It's not obvious that by using that method to introduce new terms, you're thereby introducing the capacity to refer to a new kind of object. Is there an ontological difference that goes with that methodological difference? We saw the example of theoretical entities where Sellars wants to insist there isn't an ontological difference that goes with that way of introducing new vocabulary, the theoretical. In general, let's look out in a compare and contrast way to try and understand the relation between these two ways of introducing new vocabulary, new terms, on the one hand by theoretical postulation, on the other hand by abstraction. They both end up with things that, at least to begin with, are only accessible to us inferentially. That's sort of the definition of the postulational side. But if you think about the process of introducing a term by abstraction, you have to go through using the old vocabulary and some equivalence relation in order to get the applicability of a term like the direction of the Earth's axis. So those are, at least to begin with, only inferentially accessible too. Sellars is going to take diametrically opposed stances towards these two ways of introducing objects, introducing terms for objects, saying the theoretical postulation doesn't give you access to a new kind of thing, it just gives you a new kind of access to the things that are there anyway. Whereas he wants to say abstraction, there really aren't any things referred to, anyway, not in the world in the narrow sense, as he says. But he does think that ontologically we should have the same policy towards everything that's introduced by abstraction. Why these difference in attitudes? What's the motivation for that? What turns on that? And his view is that, at least for the cases that matter for thinking about universals, one kind of term that's introduced by abstraction, the difference is that that way of introducing terms is essentially metalinguistic. That's the lesson he takes from Carnap. And we saw once the sort of bad arguments in the vicinity have been pushed to one side, he thinks the key sort of idiom for universals is what he calls classifying contexts. When we say triangularity is a property. So we've introduced a singular term, triangularity, picking out a universal or a property. And then we've said something about it. We've introduced the sortal. What kind of a thing is it? It's the property. The property of being triangular, we could say, is like the direction of a line. So we have singular terms and sortals related in these classifying contexts. So he likes Carnap's idea that we should understand those metalinguistically. Carnap had said that's saying that the expression is triangular, quote, is triangular, is a monadic predicate. And he thinks that's right-headed in general, but it can't be right just put that way for two reasons. One, when I say triangularity is a property, I'm not talking about the word triangular. I could say exactly the same thing in German, and I wouldn't be talking about either the English word or the German word. And second, I have, after all, these are, after all, classifying contexts. I've said something about triangularity, classified it as having the property of being a property. So the worry is that Carnap has just traded universals in general for these metalinguistic, syntactic universals. But if you think universals are metaphysically puzzling or ontologically suspect, having reduced the case to a small special case may be progress, but it isn't getting you over the metaphysical puzzlement. You've still got a kind of universal in play. And he has basically two responses to this, to the view that these are not metalinguistic in a straightforward syntactic or even semantic sense. He says, well, we need a fancy new kind of quotation that can have them be metalinguistic, but at more of a distance from the linguistic expressions that they're talking about. And that's where he introduces dot quotes, which assimilate expressions that play the same functional role, the same role in language entry, language exit transitions, and especially in language moves, and forms a sortal that applies to all of them. And the rules for this special kind of quotation are that we specify that role by offering an illustrating sign design from the very language that the quotation name is in. So we say in German, the word, quote, rot, is a dot red. The dot red is a sortal that applies to rot in German, to rouge in French, and to red in English. But we pick that out by giving an instance of an expression that plays that role in whatever language the dot quote name is in. So now we're going to be able to say, triangulars are monadic predicates. Indeed, we'll be able to say not just that, but that all triangulars are dot monadic predicates, in the way we would say all lions are mammals, for instance. And for the second one, he wants us to take an inegalitarian attitude towards ones in many. That's his generic sortal. And he's going to say that some of them are more objectionable than others. The ones he objects to are the ones in many that are universals, that have instances. Some kind of plurals are the kind that he says is okay. So he's going to allow Leo is a lion, where that means Leo is one of the lions, and he thinks of lions as a plural. I'm going to say more about that. That's our topic for today. But his general strategy is to say there are different kinds of ones in many, different kinds of repeatables under which you can classify things. And the metaphysics, the ontology, is different for some of them than it is for others. That's the general strategy. Okay. So starting off today, looking at naming and saying, I want to talk about the relation between ontological nominalism and Sellars' particular version. I think Sellars is an ontological nominalist, but he's also what I call a nominalization nominalist. And that nominalization, nominalism, is invoking the metalinguistic move that he takes from Carnap. A nominalization is a grammatical transformation that turns some other part of speech into a noun, into a name. So moving from the predicate adjective is triangular to triangularity is nominalizing it, giving that adjective the grammatical form of a singular term. And in the same way, turning the sortal lion with its associated predicate adjective is a lion into lionhood, is nominalizing it. Lionhood's a singular term. Lion is a sortal term. So you're nominalizing what's a sortal term by turning it into a singular term. And Sellars wants to give metalinguistic accounts of nominalizations, nominalization moves. I think it's interesting and important question what the relationship is between Sellars' constructive nominalization nominalism that we started to look at last week and ontological nominalism, which he also endorses, though as we'll see in a distinctive version. So I gave you on the website a chart of the Lviv-Warsaw School of Logic, because I don't assume that you know all of these distinguished gentlemen. Sort of founder of the school is Twardowski. He, I believe, was in Lviv, which, these days we have to, it's anyway worth reminding ourselves, that is the Ukrainian city of Lviv. Lviv, it was in Poland at that time when the Russians came in. They pushed all the Poles back into Poland and just left the Ukrainian population, but it and Warsaw were very tightly connected, particularly the universities. So Twardowski, not really a logician himself, but he was the Polish logician of his generation, flourishing around the turn of the century, and had most of the rest of these as students. Now, the big one on down the line is Tarski, maybe the greatest logician of the 20th century, certainly among a handful of them. But he was just one of a school. He was younger than the four that I focus on here: Jukowicz, Koterbinski, Lisniewski, and Lukasiewicz. I assume one has heard of these names, but maybe doesn't know just what they did. It's important in this connection that Lisniewski was the first mereologist. That's where Leonard sort of started. Goodman's collaborator, Leonard. But for our purposes, Kotarbinsky is the important one. Anyway, all these guys knew each other. They worried about each other's work. Tarski was certainly completely on top of what all of them were doing. You can see the effects of Kotarbinsky's nominalism, ontological nominalism, in Tarski's model theory, which just has domains of objects as its ontology. So Kotarbinsky usually called his view reism, R-E-I-S-M, after the Latin word res, R-E-S, meaning thing. All there is in the world is things. The world is a collection of things, you see, not of facts, as the Tractatus would claim. But sometimes he uses the term nominalism because he said, by thing, I mean what's nameable, what you can give a name to. So I think nominalism and reism, as Kotarbinsky's using them, two ways of talking about the same thing. Question of whether you're specifying it sort of from the side of the language or from the side of the things. Quine says a singular term is an expression that purports to refer to one and only one thing. And immediately says, and that talk of purport, because after all, you can have a term that doesn't actually refer to anything, like Pegasus. Quine hastens to add that that talk of purport is a colorful way of talking about the grammatical role that the expression plays. Quine, when he's making this remark, is thinking, look, you know what things are. And singular terms I'm going to tell you about because of their semantic relation to particular things. Other people have thought, well, do we really have a better grip on the notion of a thing than we do on the notion of a singular term? As I say, should we approach it from the side of the things or from the side of the language? I think the clearest term to use on the side of the things is particular, because people often use object or thing to contrast, for instance, with events or with processes, of which events are often thought of as limiting cases, whereas events and processes are also particulars. You can pick them out with singular terms, events like the flipping of the switch or the Second World War. Those are events or processes, but they're particulars. They're picked out by singular terms. On the side of language, as I've just been speaking, I've been talking about singular terms rather than names. The use of name here is, well, traditional medieval, but in modern usage, particularly in the Polish logicians, I think it's downstream from Frege's use of Eigennamen for a singular term. Eigennamen is proper name, but he used it for definite descriptions as well. Normally, singular terms are thought of as having a couple of species, different kinds of singular terms. Proper names, like Frege or Leibniz, definite descriptions, like the present King of France or the President of the United States, but also some indexical expressions, I and you, even here and now, are singular terms picking out particulars, particular places, particular times. Again, is a time a thing? Well, it's a particular. You pick it out with a singular term. Demonstrative expressions. If I say that pig, it'd be a mistake to assimilate that to a definite description. It has token reflexive characters. That's Reichenbach's way of talking about these, in that if you want to know what particular it refers to, you can't decide it once and for all for the type, as perhaps you can for what Russell called logically proper names, where the ideal, at least, is that all of the tokens of that type co-refer. Now, our ordinary names, we can have more than one person named Aristotle, and this causes problems for that ideal. But Reichenbach said expressions like I or you, different tokens of those will refer to different individuals, to different particulars. They're token reflexive, as opposed to being type invariant, where all the tokens of the same type co-refer. Some definite descriptions, the Earth's only natural satellite, a way of picking out the moon, all the tokens of that co-refer. Others don't. The senator made a spectacle of himself yesterday. Well, maybe there's more than one of those, and I'm really using that expression demonstratively to pick out just one of them. So if you think about singular terms, proper names, definite descriptions, I will say once you allow token reflexives, indefinite descriptions can also serve as singular terms. They're not always quantificational expressions. I can introduce a character in my story by saying, yesterday a senator introduced this bill that I think is the silliest thing. He should never have done it. I have to have some sort of particular senator in mind, but I introduce him with the indefinite description and then pick it up with the pronoun he. Yeah, that very senator, the one I was talking about. In making it explicit, I talk about these in terms of anaphoric chains, anaphoric initiators, and so on. That's deeper in the woods than we need to go right now. I can't resist mentioning, while we're in the vicinity, so the proper names, definite descriptions, indexicals, and demonstratives. The indexicals and demonstratives belong in a box as token reflexives, suggested. Really, if we're going to be fussy about it, it's tokenings rather than tokens. That is, unrepeatable events of using the expression. I say this is a fussy point, but think about the religious fanatic who has a sign that says, "You are a sinner" on it, and an arrow, and goes around pointing at people in the crowd. Well, there's only one token, that arrow or the "you" with the arrow, but everybody he points it at, that's a different tokening, and the "you" refers to different people each time he points it. So strictly we should talk about tokening reflexives rather than token reflexives. Other fussy point in the vicinity, there's been a permanent temptation since people have explicitly worried about these things to assimilate demonstratives to indexicals, to think of saying that pig as invoking indices having to do with the utterance of the expression in the way that I picks up the index of who the speaker is, here picks up the index of the place of utterance, now picks up the index of the time of utterance. And don't just think about these pure indexicals. There's more complicated ones you can build on this. If I use an expression like my mother's favorite color, if you want to compute what the referent of that term is, you need somebody's favorite color, whose favorite color, somebody's mother's favorite color, whose mother's favorite color, the speaker. So that's an indexical expression every bit as much as I is, even though we've leveraged that indexical to get out far away from me. If her favorite color is yellow, I'm a long way from being that color, but we've leveraged the indexical in order to get to there. And the temptation to assimilate demonstratives to indexicals is to say, well, there's a demonstration. It's relative to, in the paradigm case, who I'm pointing at when I say, you're a sinner. But that's actually a mistake because what demonstratives depend on is some much muddier notion of pragmatic salience. So when I say that pig is grunting, Lewis says, I'm saying the most salient pig is grunting. I can make him salient by pointing at him, but there's other ways of making him salient. Typically, deciding what the salience-making feature is and deciding what the referent is are parts of the same process. You can't do the one without the other. You don't know until you've sort of settled what we're talking about, what it was that made that the most salient thing. There isn't a clean, determinable in advance index the way who's the speaker, what's the time of the speaker, what's the place of the speech act, what's the possible world that the speech act takes place in. Lewis says actual is an indexical. Demonstratives are more complicated than that. Okay, that was a long, mostly aside on singular term, which is the language side of the nominalism. And the nominalism is saying it's only things that can be picked out by singular terms that are real, that are in the world. Sellars' phrase that we'll get our biggest clue about today is in the world in the narrow sense. Real. But if you think that only namables, only things that can be referred to by singular terms, are candidates for being real, then you have, as an urgent job, saying what's a genuine singular term, as opposed to fake ones. Koderbinski was particularly worried about that, and he had a lovely term that is hardly used these days at all for fake singular terms, things that have the surface grammar of a singular term, but really aren't. Quine's favorite example of this is sakes, as in, I did it for her sake. There aren't any sakes in the world. That's a form of speech that the idiom doing it for so-and-so's sake, we would paraphrase without a reference to a thing that was the sake of the person for whom you had done that. Kotorbinski's term for fake names, things that grammatically purport to refer to one and only one thing, but that's a sham, is animatoids. Onomos is name in Greek. Animatoids is the fake names. And we can see Sellars as claiming that universals are animatoids. The terms like triangularity, purport to be singular terms, picking out a particular kind of thing, property, but they aren't really. Not in the sense in which the nominalist is going to say only things that can be named are real. Well, not named in that sense, not referred to by that kind of expression whose surface grammar is that of a singular term. If you're going to take this nominalist or reist line metaphysically seriously, if that's going to be your criterion for ontology, then you can't just allow anything that has the surface grammar of a singular term to have ontological import. You've got to be on the lookout for animatoids. And the kind that Sellars wants to warn us particularly to be on the lookout for is metalinguistic animatoids, expressions that are, as Carnap said, covertly metalinguistic. His term is quasi-syntactic. And at this point, I can say slightly more carefully what I mean by attributing to Sellars nominalization, nominalism. He thinks that all transcategorial nominalizations are animatoids. All singular terms that are formed by nominalizing something that isn't a singular term, forming a singular term from something that isn't a singular term. He thinks that produces fake singular terms, at least in the nominalist sense of animatoids, things we should not take as our guides to ontology. Now, and that's because they're covertly metalinguistic. He thinks triangularity, any statements using that, should be paraphrased in terms of dot is triangulars. And those dot quoted expressions are explicitly metalinguistic, albeit in a distinctive sense. They don't name particular expressions. They pick out kinds of expressions, the kinds being the principle of grouping is things that play the same functional role. It's kind of metalinguistic functional classification, and it does it using the illustrating sign design principle. Now, I barely got to talk last time about the second sort of bit of technical apparatus that Sellars introduces in the essays we read, GE and AE, for last time. That's distributive singular terms. terms like the lion in the lion is tawny, and the pawn, or say the rook, in the statement, the rook moves rectilinearly in chess. But also, he wants to say, there are some, and those distributive singular terms are not metalinguistic. But he's also interested in some metalinguistic distributive singular terms like the dot wrote, the dot read. The dot read, we can say, is a predicate, for instance, in the way we can say the lion is tawny. Now, what's the point of these things? In general, I think the idea is that there are lots of ways of referring to particulars. If you're an ontological nominalist, you think that's the way to talk about what there really is to talk about particulars and not these other spooky things, universals, properties. But ordinary singular terms are one way of doing it, but there's no reason that an ontological nominalist should not accept that not only does the real world have Leo in it, who is a lion, it has lions in it. It has Leo in it, and Leonina, and if I could enumerate each of the lions, because that's just those particular lions. To talk about lions is just to talk about them, but in, as we might say, a plural way. But it's still just particulars. And he wants to say, in the same way, so we could say lions are tawny or lions are mammals. Never mind the is tawny part of it, but we can talk about individual lions, but we can talk about lions in general, meaning all of them. Not something over and above them, just them, those lions. But because the lions are there, we can talk about them plurally, not just individually. And one way of doing that is to introduce a new singular term, the lion, and say the lion is a mammal, or the lion is tawny, which is stipulated to be equivalent to lions are tawny. That is, each lion is tawny, or if Leo is a lion, then Leo is tawny. So distributive singular term, the lion, well, that has the grammatical form of a singular term. It's a way of talking about each lion, about all the lions. So it's a way of talking plurally, but with a surface form of a singular term. So he thinks that's okay. The lion is understood as a distributive singular term. Distributive, it's used to make claims about each lion, each particular lion, but just about the particulars. It's not used to make a claim about the set of lions or the species of lion, just about all those lions, all those particular lions. So Sellars thinks that's an okay kind of nominalization, distributive singular terms should be nominalistically acceptable in the language. We should not treat the lion as an animatoid. And in particular, there's nothing metalinguistic about it. It's just a way of talking about particulars, a sort of roundabout way of talking about lions. Now, why do we need to do that? Well, here's a bit of semantic grammatical subtlety about the difference between predicate adjectives like is triangular and is red, and sortal terms like lion. I mentioned last time that Frege in the Grundlagen starts with ordinary predicate terms, adjectival predicate terms like red and triangular, and says those have criteria of application that settle whether the predicate applies to something. Is it red? Is it triangular? He doesn't mention it, but they come with consequences of application. If it's triangular, then the sum of its angles is 180 degrees. If it's red, then it's colored. And sortal terms like lion come with those too. Because there is a predicate adjective that goes with it. Is a lion. Leo is a lion, Leo is tawny. There are criteria of application of being a lion. There are consequences of being a lion, same as there is for being triangular or being red. But in addition, sortal terms come with criteria of identity and individuation that make it sensible to ask, is this the same lion as that? Triangle, as opposed to triangular, is a sortal term. We can ask, is this the same triangle as that? Red doesn't have a sortal like that unless, is this the same red as that? We mean shade of red. And shade is a sortal. So we might want to separate, at least conceptually, the property-like features of lion, being a lion, from the term-like features, the ones that let us count lions, that let us identify and individuate lions, the ones that determine, is this the same lion as that? Particularly if we're ontologically suspicious about properties, like being a lion, but not ontologically suspicious about lions, the particular things. And distributive singular terms are focusing on the term-like character, the picking out of these particulars, and pushing into the background the property-like, the fact that every sortal also comes with a predicate adjective, that with lion comes is a lion, is a lion, not is red, but is a lion is also a predicate adjective. The fact that we put that indefinite article in there is showing that that property also comes with criteria of identity and individuation, that you can count these things. So Sellars' apparatus of distributive singular terms is supposed to concentrate the sense in which sortal terms, like lion, are terms, focusing on the way they pick out particulars, not the property, to speak with the vulgar, that the particulars they pick out share, in virtue of which they are lions rather than snakes or something like that. Oh. Okay. Let me stop there. There's a lot of distinctions and so on the table. Singular terms, the kinds of singular terms, sortals, predicate adjectives, different kinds of nominalization. Sellars thinks that you can form distributive singular terms without going metalinguistic, but if you form singular terms from things that aren't singular terms, from things of other grammatical categories, if you nominalize them, that you're going to have to understand that metalinguistically. So the paradigm for him is forming a noun from an adjective, forming redness from red, forming triangularity from his triangular, even sortal terms. If you don't go the distributive, if you don't go to the plural, lions, and from there to distributive singular terms, the lion, but if you do the same thing to the predicate adjective part of lion, is a lion, that you did to his triangular, and form lionhood, that's a transcategorial nominalization, and we have to understand that in terms of talk about dot quote lion. And he thinks the same thing if what you're nominalizing is from yet another part of speech, declarative sentences. So I can use the sentence, the frog is on the log, but I can also form the singular term, the proposition that the frog is on the log, or the claim or statement that, as long as I mean the claimable or the stateable that, not the claiming or the stating that. I mean, that's another kind of nominalization, but the kind that gets you to his horror of propositions is the nominalization that specifies the conceptual content expressed by declarative sentences. The proposition that P, for some declarative sentence, P, he's saying you're going to have to understand that, the proposition that the frog is on the log, you have to understand that in terms of the dot, the frog is on the log. Yes.
So this might be a silly question, but I'm curious about what you think these linguistic observations, like how they're serving as evidence in his argument. So, I mean, it seems like you could say that these observations about how language works are just like part of the argument structure in the sense that they're contestable observations. But you might think that he needs them to just be observations about how language is working, and so they just are like the kinds of observations that are amenable
So I'm not sure I'm getting what you're after, but I think he's doing two kinds of things here. Some of it is making observations about distinctions between sortal predicates and merely adjectival predicates. And part of it, and those are contestable and there are border cases, we might in the end take issue with the lines he's drawing there. On the other hand, he's also doing something constructive. He's saying, let me specify a new kind of quotation, dot quotation. Here's how to understand dot red. It's a sortal that applies to all and only expressions that play in their home language the same functional role that red plays in English. Those are the linguistic expressions that fall under the sortal quote. Red. I should have do it in my own language. So we can say, quote, in the ordinary sense of quote, rot is a dot red. The way we can say Leo is a lion. Now, that's, he gets to say what he means by dot quotes, and he's using some of the apparatus that he's made contestable observations about in order to stipulate the use of this. But he can't be wrong in the same way about that he might be about the way he describes the difference between sortals and non-sortal predicates. And similarly with distributive singular terms, he's introducing this use, stipulating how to do it, and then wants to do things with that. He wants to in particular, wants to distinguish true names from animatoids for the purpose of ontological nominalism. Is that responsive?
Yeah, that's helpful.
Now look, the overall lesson I think I would like to draw from this discussion is if you start off as an ontological nominalist, paradigm Kotarbinsky, and you claim that the only candidates for being real, for being in the world, in the ontologically demanding sense, in the narrow sense, is things that can be referred to by singular terms, or as he says loosely, names. If you say that, then that puts a lot of weight on the distinction between real names and merely apparent names. You're not going to be excluding anything to speak of. By that requirement, if anything that has the surface grammar of a singular term counts as picking out a candidate for being real, because we've got sakes and we've got properties like triangularity and propositions, like the proposition that the frog is on the log. You can nominalize anything. Give it the surface grammar of a singular term. So if being a nominalist is going to be an intelligible position, if it's going to rule anything out, you've got to worry about the distinction between real names and animatoids, things that merely look like singular terms. And that's the issue that Sellars addresses immediately in the essays we read last time. He says, here's a way of understanding why triangularity is an animatoid. It's because it's covertly metalinguistic. And that's because talk about triangularity, for instance, it's being a property, ought to be understood in a perspicuous language as talk about the dot is triangular, that's sortal, and that's a metalinguistic sortal. And Sellars is going to claim metalinguistic particulars are different. They're not in the world in the narrow sense. He hasn't told us why that's so, but you can see the strategy here. He's going to give us a way of understanding a whole class of philosophically important singular terms as covertly metalinguistic, and therefore the claim is animatoids, not real names in the sense that the ontological nominalist restricts reality to the reference of real names. So, we want to know, well, why does being metalinguistic make them fake names for these ontological purposes? But we can at least see he's doing some work here that somebody like Koterbinsky or Goodman or later nominalists need to have done. And it has a specifically metalinguistic twist to it. He's going to diagnose a class of metalinguistic animatoids. That's what his account of abstracting two universals and propositions is going to give him. But now, what I've said is the ontological nominalist needs a distinction between real names and animatoids. Sellars has a strategy for giving him one. It's important to realize that drawing that distinction doesn't provide an argument for ontological nominalism. I could say to Sellars, okay, I see, you've drawn a sharp line between two classes of singular terms. And you want to say, well, that's ontologically significant. I'll just say that. But now, I think that when I say something is triangular or is tawny, I'm talking about what the real world is like. When I use those predicates, not the nominalization of them. I'm not a nominalist, so I don't have to care about triangularity. But I claim that is triangular is picking out a real bit of the world, just not a particular. It's picking out a universal. No line that you draw within the class of singular terms yet cuts or argues against my claim that there's more in the world than particulars, that there's universals and propositions and so on in it. I mean, that's the way I put it, universals and propositions. But, okay, I'm falling into sort of nominalizing these things. What I'm saying is that corresponding to predicates is bits of reality. Corresponding to declarative sentences are facts, which are not, on my reading, a kind of particular. They're a different kind of thing, and I'm saying there's more than particulars in the world, in reality. You can't argue against that sort of non-nominalist realism about these other parts of speech by drawing a line within the category of singular terms and pointing out that some of those singular terms are formed from these other parts of speech, are nominalizations of them. And you say, well, that just gives you fake nominalizations. And I can say, okay, I buy all of that. But that still doesn't tell me that there isn't something in reality corresponding to these other parts of speech, these predicates, these sortals, including the adjectival part of the predicate, these declarative sentences. So if you already start off as an ontological nominalist, then you need a line drawn of the sort that Sellars is giving us a lot of help in drawing between different classes of singular terms. But that doesn't have the right form to be an argument for ontological nominalism. That's got to come somewhere else. That's the conclusion that's the state of play that I see as we go into naming and saying here. Okay. Well, and basically the rest of the course is about sort of that issue, what could be said for and again that way in the world. But one thing we need to address need to understand is what Sellars means anyway when he distinguishes between things that are in the world in the narrow sense and are in the world only in the broader sense. As I said, looking at these different kinds of speech, parts of speech, can show us a lot of lines that you might take to be ontologically significant. The way Sellars takes the distinction between what's expressed by singular terms, real singular terms, and any other parts of speech to be ontologically significant. Only what's referred to by genuine singular terms is a candidate for being real, being in the world in the narrow sense. But what is that sense? It's one thing to draw the line, but now to draw these various lines, sortals can be distinguished from singular terms, but they can also be distinguished from merely adjectival predicates. The declarative sentences can be distinguished from all of them. There's lots of lines there. So yeah, but this one has an ontological significance. The world in the narrow sense, that's what's real. The world only in a broader sense, what is that? And here, if you look at the passages from naming and saying that are on the website, I think it's the second passage there anyway. It's from 103. It's tagged with 103. He says, two alternatives are considered. The objects in atomic facts are one, without exception, particulars. Two, one or more particulars plus a universal. That's Gustav Bergman is his stalking horse in this case, but lots of people believe this. I mentioned closer to our own time, David Armstrong, for instance, would be mentioned, would be a Bergmanian in this crude way of dividing things. It's argued that one is both Wittgenstein's view in the Tractatus and correct. It's also argued that exemplification, so that's the relation between a universal and a particular, is a quasi-semantical relation. That's Carnap's successor notion to quasi-syntactic, once he allowed semantic meta-languages as well as syntactic ones. And that exemplification, and universals are in the world only in the broad sense in which the world includes linguistic norms and roles viewed, thus in translating, from the standpoint of a fellow participant. Now here I think he's giving us the crucial clue about what he means by the world in the narrow sense. And we're going to see that in Science and Metaphysics, his Locke lectures, this distinction is the topic of the book. And it's crucial to him to line this up with Kant's distinction between noumena and phenomena. The real contrasts with appearances. The real is things as they are in themselves. Phenomena, the phenomenal world in Kant, is the world in relation to us. The world as it shows up for creatures like us, where you've got to take us into account. So the Kantian challenge is to say of features of the way we take things to be, which ones are only there because of our contribution to our relation to this world, and which of them are there apart from all relation to us, as they are in themselves. Now, of course, this is an immensely crude characterization, but I meant it to be crude enough to encompass various readings of things in themselves in contemporary readings of Kant. Sellars, I think, here is saying, in the world in the narrow sense, here he's using the contrasting broad sense, elsewhere uses the narrow sense. That's what's there and would be there if there were no discursive beings at all. Whereas what's in the world in the broad sense includes linguistic norms and the people who apply them and the language they speak and the lines that they draw, the way it's sensible to them to group things together. All of that's in relation to our activities. And, he doesn't want to denigrate that and say that doesn't matter. I mean, of course, that stuff matters, but he wants ontologically to keep a separate set of books on the stuff that's there apart from any relation to us. So that one body is more massive than another, that one is moving faster than another. Those are features of the world independently of the way people specify them. That I measure the mass with a certain unit? No, that's a matter of my choice of the units for the mass. Do I want to do it in grams or in pounds? The fact that the theory has gravitational force attenuating with the square of the distance, that's not sort of up to me or dependent on me. The fact that I describe it in English, that's obviously something I'm bringing to the party. Anyway, something that's happening only in relation to me. The algebraic representation of that square law attenuation, that has historical antecedents, depends Now, if you're drawing that line, clearly anything that's metalinguistic is on the broad side, not the narrow side of that line. Dot-quoted expressions, those sortals that classify linguistic expressions according to the roles they play in our discursive practices, well, that doesn't make any sense apart from reference to human discursive practices. That's on the us side, not on the it side of this line. Now, exactly what you make of this, of the significance of this line, well, you might think it was really important. You might think it was not important at all. But you can see why it would be worth drawing it sharply and being able to think about it. And why metalinguistic things would be on one side of it. Now, just to Sellarsian phrase, beat around in the neighboring bushes a little bit. The picture is to sort of see what rabbits run out if you do that. Hegel was withering in his contempt for one of Kant's most famous and in many ways inspiring remarks. Kant says, there are only two things that fill his heart with awe: the starry skies above me and the moral law within me. And Hegel says, this is only half right. Yes, the moral law, though he thinks Kant's looking for it in the wrong place, it's not in him as opposed to in us. It's a matter of Geist, of all of us. But to be in awe of the starry skies above him, Hegel was famous for treating the stars as he put it, a mere rash on the sky. Why this dismissiveness? Because all that mattered to him is human beings and what human beings do. That was what he thought was worth thinking about and being inspired by. The rest of it is just sort of the way things happen to be. He only cared about things that, as William James said, had the trail of the human serpent on them. He had the view that Peirce, one of our great philosophers of science, had when he said, the most interesting property of phosphorus atoms is the role they play in human brains. The rest of it's only interesting if, in the end, it'll help us understand that property that they have. Well, all right. Hegel and maybe Peirce, once we've drawn this distinction between the non-human, non-discursive world, the world apart from any relation to us, cognitive or practical, and the world in the broad sense that includes our activities, our norms, our discursive practices, are going to say, yeah, well, like Alexander Pope, the proper study of mankind is man. It is those discursive activities. That's what's of principal philosophical interest. Okay, maybe so. Certainly my heart's on that side. Nonetheless, the enterprise of drawing that line, of saying, well, what can we say about the world apart from its relation to all those things, the world in this narrow sense? And what an astonishing thing it would be if one thing you could say about it is it only has particulars in it. Anything else is a matter of its relation to us. What's out there independent of us is just one damn thing after another. Just those particular things. And to talk about facts and the properties that particulars have, the relations that they stand in to one another, because those are universals too. To talk about all of that is to talk exclusively about the appearance of the world in the Kantian sense, to talk about the world in relation to us. What's out there independently of its relation to us is just particulars. That's ontological nominalism. And that's the metaphysical arena, that is the relation between this distinction, way of distinguishing reality and appearance, where appearance is not mere appearance. Things show up to us as objects with properties standing in relations and facts, constituting facts about them. But he wants to claim, in the sense Kant cared about, that's the phenomenal world. That's not the noumenal world. And remember from the Scientia Mensura, he wants to say that natural science has a distinctive authority in making claims about the real in that narrow sense. That's why it's natural science that he cares about, not social science. So the Geisteswissenschaften, they're studying the world in the broader sense, not in the narrow sense. But he's committed then to saying, yeah, and natural science is the study exclusively of particulars. How can you think of it as not studying the relations, the properties, the facts? And there's a concern that there's different distinctions getting run together here. Science and metaphysics is his attempt to sort of line them all up or get clear about how they're lined up. Okay, so this, I claim, is the first time I've really gotten on the table the issues that I want to sort of spend the rest of the course talking about. Sellars as metaphysician is most concerned with this line between what there is in the narrow sense and what there is in the wide sense, the broad sense, he says, where the broad sense is features of it that it only has in relation to knowers and agents, to seekers and speakers of truth. Can we make sense of the world apart from that? Remember, Kant himself is quite skeptical about that, about what we can know or even intelligibly say, whether we could know it to be true or not, about things in themselves. Sellars is going to have a much more expansive view about that. Okay, but I hope it's at least clear, there's a colorable distinction here between colorable and interesting, potentially interesting distinction between the world in the narrow sense and the world in the broad sense, if by that we mean the world as it is apart from its relation to human activities or the activities of discursive creatures. Generally, humans are the only ones we happen to know about, but the Kantian question is about sort of rational creatures generally. Clearly, drawing the line that way, claims whose content is essentially metalinguistic are going to go on the broad side rather than the narrow side. If they're metalinguistic, that's to say they're about discursive activity. They essentially depend for their content on reference to language use. Now, last point before we take a break. In the very first class, when I was talking about Sellars as a Kantian and what Kantian ideas does he make something of, I said Kant's normative turn. That's a huge one. The distinction between us and it is the distinction between creatures who are bound by norms and ones who aren't. That knowing and acting intentionally are a matter of undertaking commitments, binding oneself by rules. That was the first point. But the second one was Kant's doctrine of categories. That Kant distinguished between concepts whose basic use is to describe and explain the antics of empirical objects around us, ordinary empirical, descriptive, and explanatory concepts, and their sophisticated scientific descendants on the one hand. But he said, but there are other concepts whose distinctive expressive job is not to describe and explain how things are. It's rather to make explicit the framework within which description and explanation is possible at all. And those are the pure concepts of the understanding, the categories. He says those we grasp a priori in that you have to have already mastered those concepts in order to apply any empirical concepts. They're implicit in the use of any empirical concepts. And I said one of the things that Sellars saw in Carnap was that Carnap was a Kantian in this regard, and that Carnap had a new way of thinking about Kantian categorical concepts, though Carnap never thought of what he was doing this way. But Sellars saw Carnap as a neo-Kantian, and that Carnap's master idea was that to understand the Kantian categories as metalinguistic concepts. And we'll see next week that the principle one, the paradigm of a categorical concept for Kant is the concept of a necessary connection, the concept of a law. What's expressed by alethic modal vocabulary that he claims is a necessary feature of describing and explaining things. But for Kant, it's part of our contribution, not part of what's there in the things themselves. Now we'll be looking at alethic modal concepts and the metalinguistic analysis of them. It's a good test bench. That's what we'll be doing next week. But Sellars is going to claim that there are Kantian categories, there are concepts whose principal expressive function is to make explicit features of the framework that makes description and explanation possible. But all of them are metalinguistic, and so all of them are on the side of us rather than on the side of the way the world is independently of us. What's expressed by subjunctive conditionals, what's expressed by laws of nature, all of those make essential use of categorical concepts, essential use of concepts that Sellars wants to understand as metalinguistic. Now that sets a challenging philosophy of science task for him. Okay, well, that's a good place to break. We'll come back and I'll walk a little more carefully through some of these naming and saying passages. Let's come back at in 15 minutes. I make that at 2:43. Okay, well, I'd like to talk about the naming and saying essay at this point. One task for a nominalist is to say what it is to say something, as opposed to just refer to a particular. That's really why we need ones in many, and so need to distinguish between the ones that are good ones in many, ontologically speaking, and the ones that are bad. So Sellars sets up the discussion here in a way that's characteristic of many of his essays as a sort of dialogue. I mean, he's conducting it, but two opposing views. How are we to adjudicate that? What are we to say about it? And I think it's only a little bit later in the essay that he is clear about what these two views are. But if you look at passages from 108, the difference between what he takes to be the Tractarian view, he's going to say Wittgenstein and Bergman. I say he's very much aware that Bergman thinks that the view Bergman is putting forward is Wittgenstein's view in the Tractatus, but Sellars claims that's not so. The difference can be reformulated in such a way as to bring out its kinship with the old issue between realists and nominalists. Wittgenstein is telling us that the only objects in the world are particulars, and Bergman is telling us that the world includes as objects both particulars and universals. Now, the very first sentence of the Tractatus is, the world is everything that is the case, the sum of facts, not of things. The Tractatus is a paradigm of a non-nominalist work, I claim. But Sellars is reading it in a nominalist way, contrasting it with Bergman. I think Bergman is wrong too about it, and I will only mention in passing some exegetical issues about the Tractatus. The view that Sellars is endorsing and putting into the mouth of the author of the Tractatus is the one that it's important to contrast with Bergman. Wittgenstein is telling us that the only objects in the world are particulars, and Bergman is telling us that the world includes as objects, well, anyway, that the world includes both particulars and universals. Bergman thinks that the only relation we need to worry about is exemplification, the relation between particulars and universals. Some of the universals are relational universals, but the relation that matters is between the two kinds of things, between particulars and universals. That's what we call exemplification. And what are ordinarily said to be relations, for example, being below, that's just a relational universal. That's just one of the things that's there, which can be exemplified by two of the particulars. Now, the passage that Sellars focuses on, this is back on 104, early in the passages. The crucial passage is, of course, 3.1432, quote, "We must not say the complex sign ARB says A stands in the relation R to B. But we must say that A stands in a certain relation to B says that ARB." Now, Wittgenstein, what is the relation that A stands in to B? Well, that's, in this notation, having a capital R between them. But we could do it otherwise. The crucial point that Wittgenstein is making emerges when we ask, what are the parts of the statement in question, the relation of which to one another is essential to its character as a statement? That is, as saying something. What Wittgenstein tells us is that while superficially regarded, the statement is a concatenation of three parts, A and R and B. Viewed more profoundly, it's a two-termed fact, with R coming to the statement as bringing it about that the expressions A and B are dyadically related in a certain way, as bringing it about that the expressions A and B are related as having an R between them. Indeed, he's telling us that it's philosophically clarifying to recognize that instead of expressing the proposition that A is next to B by writing is next to between A and B, we could write A in some relation to B using only these signs. And now Sellars introduces his third bit of technical machinery, the first two being dot quotes and dot quotes formed using the illustrative sign design principle, and distributive singular terms. He introduces jumblies. Now, I put on the website the Edward Lear poem, The Jumblies, that Sellars is talking about here. What matters is just the refrain, few and far, far and few are the lands where the jumblies live. The rest of it is the color of their hands and faces, and not really part of what he's invoking. It's all right, there aren't really any jumblies, but jumblies is the language he's imagining them speaking. And jumblies is a perspicuous language, according to the view that he's attributing to the Tractatus, and we'll say in a minute what being perspicuous is, but he means something very clear by it. And remember, the question is, what relation among the expressions that occur in a linguistic statement is it in virtue of which it says something, paradigmatically, that things are thus and so? What relation among those signs is it? Because just a list of singular terms, a list of names, doesn't say anything. It's just a list of names. It doesn't say that something has a property or the two things stand in a relation. It doesn't say anything. The question, this is a question that in the early years of the 20th century, when Russell's being an atomist, the Tractatus is new. Sometimes the slogan used to refer to it was asking about the unity of the proposition. What is it that makes the bits of an expression of a proposition into the expression of a proposition, and not just a bunch of references to things? Bergman is going to say, well, it's that at least one of the expressions refers to a universal. Which expresses a property of or a relation between the objects that are referred to by the names. And the view Sellars is pushing resists that. It says, no, it's just the relation between the names that makes it a statement. So, before we know what perspicuous means, in a perspicuous language, we would express the proposition that A is next to B by putting the names A and B into some kind of relation. So, in particular, we might write that in Jumblese. And the fact that the name A is over the name B in the expression means that A is next to B, or is taller than B, or stands in any other relation that we want. The point is that relations among names express relations among the objects. Now that's a Tractarian sounding thing. In Jumblese, there are no expressions except names, singular terms. I'm not going to be careful about that distinction. Sellars isn't. He's talking about naming here. I've given the distinctions that would be needed to clean this up. In Jumblese, that expression means that A is next to B. To represent that certain objects satisfy an n-adic concept, one makes their names satisfy an n-adic concept. Now, what's in the background here is F.H. Bradley's argument. Bradley said, so this is Jumblese. This is not Jumblese. Here's Bradley. He says, well, to understand relations, and now Bradley is not talking about the language, he's talking about the real thing. We've got A related to B. And again, it doesn't matter what the relation admires is next to or fine. Well, but to understand that, you've got to understand what the relationship is between A and the relation. And what the relation between B and the relation is. Now, whatever this first one is, let's call that R1, and this other R2. But to understand that, we better understand what the relationship is between B and that relation, the relation that it stands into this relation. And so on. Now, we're off to the races here. This Bradleyan regress that he's talking about has a form that ought to be familiar. It's an instance of the Agrippin trilemma. Because what's going to happen with this? Either we've got a regress and we can't understand the first R until we understand the second two, and we can't understand them until we understand those relations, and we've got an infinite regress, and we can't make the relation between A and B intelligible. Or we go round in a circle, and at some point one of these relations repeats, but we still don't understand what's going on. Or at some point we get to something that doesn't admit of this kind of regressive question, something that just holds things together without our having to ask how it gets a grip on those things. Now remember, the original Agrippin trilemma looked at justification as a relation and set up the same trilemma. And I suggested that this very same form comes up for Descartes, not in epistemology, but in semantics, where we've got one thing that's a representing of something else. So we know what's represented by knowing the representing. But it looks like we must have to represent that representing in order to know it. And either that's a regress, and it's not possible actually to represent anything, or it goes around in a circle and never achieves the representing, or there's some relation to some representing that isn't a representational relation. That's a matter of our immediately grasping that representing. And those he calls mental things. That's semantically of this same form. Here's Bradley's metaphysical form of the Agrippin trilemma. Now, seeing the common structure of these arguments should make you interested in ways of evading getting caught in them. What are the presuppositions here? I suggested, for instance, in the case of the original epistemological one, that default and challenge structure of justification that didn't see positive justificatory status as always and only inherited from something else that had it, was a sensible way of evading the trilemma. No, it's not any of those three things. And there's semantic versions of that as well. Bradley's conclusion was that what he called external, the medieval scholastic advice is, when faced with a contradiction, make a distinction. And Bradley follows that advice. He makes a distinction. He says, well, there's external relations and internal relations. And this regress applies only to external relations. And so what we need to conclude is that all relations are internal. Atomism is the view that all relations are external. And it was in these terms that Bertrand Russell, having been a Bradleyan, recoiled from it to being an atomist and facing the problem of the unity of the proposition. How do you evade Bradley's regress? Paradigm of the distinction between internal and external relations. Bradley says, think of a ladder. The relation between the ladder and the thing and the wall that it leans up against is an external relation. The wall would be just what it is if it didn't have a ladder leaning up against it. The ladder would still be the ladder if it weren't leaning up against the wall, but they stand in this external relation. An internal relation is the relation between the rungs and the rails of the ladder. If they don't stand in that relation to each other, there is no ladder. That relation is internal to the ladder. All relations are internal. Internal to what? The absolute. Yeah. Because it only applies if you're building up from the bottom, not if you're analyzing a thing that starts off unified and now you're carving bits out of it. This is what one of Sellars' star students, Hector Neri Castaneda, and an important philosopher in his own right, who was Guatemalan, referred to with serious irony as Guatemalan jungle ontology. There's just this featureless jungle, and we count on the American Fruit Company to come in with their machetes and put clearings in it and distinguish different bits of it. So that's the way they think about it anyway. It's all internal relations. Russell described this as you're having to choose between thinking of the world as a bowl of jelly, which you could take some of out with a spoon, or as a bucket of shotgun shot, just little spheres. That was the atomistic view. And he came to think that only the atomistic view was sensible. Whitehead, Russell's collaborator in Principia, accused both parties, the holists and the atomists, of what he called the fallacy of lost contrast. He says, the distinction between internal and external relations makes sense as long as there are both of them. But as soon as you claim, well, here's this distinction which is intelligible, but let me tell you, really everything's on one side of it. Well, on one side of what now? What does the distinction, what are you saying when you say they're all internal or they're all external, if we only made sense of those categories in a way that essentially involved the distinction between them? Again, this is telling you, well, okay, we're obviously working within too circumscribed a set of alternatives here. Okay. An absolutely key passage then is deep in the passages. It's from 123. He says, now, in a perspicuous language, i.e., a language which had a built-in protection against Bradley's puzzle. Now, he's 2/3 of the way through this essay. Somewhere I counted this, and he's used the word perspicuous 24 times before he gets to this. And he puts the definition of what he has all along meant by perspicuous, in effect, in a parenthesis. That is a language in which Bradley's regress can't be started. This is not the way to write philosophy. This makes it really hard for people coming through to figure it out. He actually did exactly the same thing with the distinction between reality in the narrow sense and the broad sense. Is just, and in passing, what I mean by that is, but it was appended to making another point. These are the critical moves and definitions that he's making here. Let's mean by perspicuous notation or language one that wouldn't certainly tempt you to the Bradleyan puzzle or wouldn't even permit it. Now you look at Jumbelese. In Jumbelese, the question is, well, what's the relation between the A and the B? There isn't some third thing, the relation, that we can now say, well, what's the relation between A and that? Well, the relation between A and in the notation is just, well, the one's over the other. That's all. What's A's relation to over? Well, it's over B. And in the world, where that means next to, the same thing. You can't ask, well, what's the relation between A and next to if you're representing it like this. Now let me say, just to get this out of the way, Bradley raised this just as a puzzle about relations, not about properties. Because if you ask about the relation between, say, green and something that is green, you immediately get to a relation between the particular and the universal. Well, that's the relation of exemplification. Now is Bergman going to have to worry about the relation between greenness and exemplification on the one hand and the grass and exemplification on the other? No. And here we go back in 109. If we so use the term relation, that to say of something that it is a relation is to say that it's perspicuously represented in discourse. This is 15 pages before he tells us what he means by that. By a configuration of expressions, rather than by the use of a separate expression, then for Bergman, there's only one relation. That is exemplification. The relation between particulars and universals, when the universal applies to the particular. And what are ordinarily said to be relations, for example, below, occur in the world as relata. Those are just relational universals. They're in the world. Because we got, for Bergman, two kinds of things in the world, particulars and universals. And the thing that you should, in a perspicuous notation, represent by a configuration of an expression for a particular, an expression, or for some particulars, an expression for a relation, is exemplification. But on the view Sellars is putting forward, there are lots of relations. There's being next to and being under and admiring and so on, each of which we're going to represent with a different configuration of names in Jumbelese. Sellars has a long excursus on whether in the Tractatus you can make sense of monadic properties. And this is something people worried about because a fact is just an arrangement of names, and you can't arrange just one name. And in the end, he says, well, regardless of how clumsy Wittgenstein's language about this is, really what we're talking about is the names having different properties. They could just be in different fonts. And if the name is in Courier font, that means that the object it refers to is green. And if it's in Comic Sans, that means the object it refers to is silly, or something like that. We could just use those different fonts. So puts that all to one side. He spends like 4 pages on this topic. Here's the key passage, I think. And this is from 109. To keep matters straight, it would be useful to introduce the term nexus in such a way that to say of something that it is a nexus is to say that it's perspicuously represented in discourse by a configuration of expressions rather than by a separate expression. If we do this, we can contrast Bergman and Wittgenstein as follows. Wittgenstein, there are many nexus in the world. Simple relations of matters of fact are nexus. All objects or individuals which form a nexus are particulars, i.e. individuals of type 0. There is no relation or nexus of exemplification in the world. Bergman, there's only one nexus, exemplification. Every atomic state of affairs contains at least one, and if the thesis of elementarism be true, at most one, individual which is not a particular. So, that's a state of affairs, something that can be said. For Bergman, to say something, you need the right number of names, and if there's n of them, an expression for an n-adic universal or relation. And Wittgenstein is saying, Sellars Wittgenstein is saying, no, you just need the n individuals, the n names, and you arrange those names in some way, in some spatiotemporal configuration, the picture is. But it could be more complicated than that. Again, if we can put them in different fonts, then the fact that this is in one font and the other one is in a different font, and this one is next to the other one, could express some more complicated relation among them. If, the passage continues, one uses the term ineffable so that to F something, loves this joke, because there isn't such a verb, ineffable, formed from that. My Dr. Father Rorty loved this too, loves to talk about effing things. Ineffable. That to F something is to signify it by using a name. Now, we can hear Kotorbinski in the background here. Then Wittgenstein's view would be that what are ordinarily called relations are ineffable, for they're all nexus and are expressed, whether perspicuously or not, by configurations of names. That is, remember, the unperspicuous representation of the relation between A and B is by putting like a big R between them instead of putting one of them above the other. That's not perspicuous, but it's still putting them into a relation. But he's saying that even in that case, what are ordinarily called relations are ineffable, for they're all nexus and are expressed by configurations of names. For Bergman, on the other hand, what are ordinarily called relations are effed. It's exemplification which is ineffable. I mean, the ineffability here, this is what, according to Sellars, Wittgenstein in the Tractatus is on about in talking about things that can only be showed, that can't be said. You say things by arranging names in a certain configuration, and the configuration shows that things are thus and so. But it doesn't, the configuration doesn't say that. It's the names that are in that configuration that say that. So, jumping to the passage at 123, Bergman thinks, to use the terminology I proposed earlier, that exemplification is the nexus, the mode of configuration of objects, some particular, some universal, which can only be expressed by a configuration of names. Professor Bergman sees configurations of particulars and universals, where Wittgenstein saw only configurations of particulars. Now, Jumbelese is going to be with us for the rest of the term. Let me mention that Sellarsians have worried a lot about what you can say in Jumbelese. Sellars here talks about a Jumbelese meta-language for Jumbelese, and it's pretty clear how that goes. I discussed this in my essay, but having names of fonts in it, for instance, so that putting a certain expression in a configuration with the name of a font can be a way of saying that in the object language it's written in that font. One of the wildest applications of Jumbelese is by Anton Koch, distinguished professor in Heidelberg. Tony gave a talk here a few years ago, and in homage to it being Pittsburgh, the home of his hero, talked about Jumbelese as the language of the world, in which he said, well, once you see language as saying things by being a configuration of particulars, the particulars may have particular properties, like being in a certain font, but they stand in relation to one another. Then I can think of the world as saying that the Cathedral of Learning is a certain distance from Heinz Chapel because it's arranged the particulars, the Cathedral of Learning and Heinz Chapel, in a particular configuration, namely being that distance apart. And in this sense, we can see the world as consisting entirely of sayings in Jumbelese. Now, this might sound like it's just silly, and you certainly don't get a language in the sense of a discursive practice that way. But this possibility is not entirely irrelevant to the story Sellars is going to tell about sayables in the world. Okay. Wittgenstein thought that the relation between a saying and what's said, that is, the configuration of objects the configuration of name objects and the configuration of named objects that is the fact that it states. He thought that was something that could only be shown and not said. That was the ineffability of the Tractatus. And Sellars is rehearsing that. You've got to have something that is the nexus, that is the relation of the names. In a perspicuous language, there wouldn't be some object that was standing in for the nexus, because having that makes you a patsy for the Bradleyan Agrippin trilemma. You would just have that configuration of things. That's a nexus. That's what you can't, certainly in that language, say. All you can do is do it. Now, Sellars here at 124 says, the crucial ineffability in the Tractatus concerns the relations between statements and facts. Is there such a relation, and is it ineffable? The answer seems to me to be the following. There is a meaning relation between statements and facts, but both terms are in the linguistic order. Facts aren't in the world in the narrow sense. A fact, as Frege says, is a true proposition. He says true thought, a true thinkable. And those are all metalinguistic, according to Sellars. But he gives us a clue here, and this will pick up passages we'll see sort of as this thought grows on him. What does it mean to say, this is at 125, that green A is a fact? Clearly this is equivalent to saying that green A is true, which calls to mind the equivalence that green A is true with green A. This, however, is not the most perspicuous way to represent matters, for while the equivalence obtains, indeed necessarily obtains, its truth depends on the principle of inference. And this is the crux, that is, that you can move back and forth inferentially between these. From that green A is true in our language to infer green A in our language. And it's by virtue of the fact that we draw such inferences that meaning in truth talk gets its connection with the world. In this sense, the connection is something done rather than talked about. Viewed from this perspective, Wittgenstein's later conception of a language as a form of life is already foreshadowed by the ineffability thesis of the Tractatus. But to see this is to see that no ineffability is involved. For while to infer from the configuration of map facts, to infer from the map fact that these two dots have a wiggly blue line in between them, that's the configuration, to infer from that you can't go from Pittsburgh to Columbus without crossing a river, to make that inference from the arrangement of particulars in the notation to a conclusion about how things are, that's to draw the inference, something done rather than talked about. For while to infer is neither to refer to that which can be referred to, nor to assert that which can be asserted, that does not mean that it's to fail to F something that is therefore ineffable. Well, here's the conclusion I think he's after. In order to have a perspicuous notation, one that doesn't set you up for the Bradleyan regress. You need something like this notion of a nexus, of the arrangement of the names, such that their being arranged like that says that the particulars stand in a certain relation. But arranging them like that is something done. That's why the nexus is ineffable. Appeal to an ineffable semantic relation, the nexus here, is a sign that you're trying to do in your semantic theory what you can only do in your pragmatic theory, in your theory about what you're doing. And that's to say, I don't claim that the ramifications of this are all clear, but that this is the claim that I think Sellars is on his way to, and that we'll catch him making later on, that you can't understand the relation between the signs in virtue of which it's a saying without talking about what you're doing in using it. I think he's ending up with an analysis here of the Bradley regress as being of a piece with the Lewis Carroll regress. Lewis Carroll imagines the logician tortoise and Achilles, and the logician writes down P, and if P then Q, P arrow Q, and draws a line and says, so you can see Q follows. And Achilles says, well, I don't see that, but you're telling me that Q follows from this. Well, let's write that down. Let's write down P and P arrow Q, that whole thing, arrow Q. Let's add that. That's the principle you say we need. Oh, wait a minute. Now that I see that, I still don't see the Q. No, but it follows from these premises. Well, then let's write that down. We get statements of modus ponens, meta-modus ponens, meta-meta-modus ponens, even though we're all doing it in the logical language. And the conclusion is that we have to make a distinction, which John Stuart Mill had already made decades before. That's what Lewis Carroll had in mind when he was writing this, that we have to distinguish between premises from which to reason and principles with which to reason. We have to have something that isn't itself a statement, but is a lived rule, something that governs our actual doing, the drawing of the conclusion. That's what is ineffable in the sense that you can't write it down, in the sense that anything you do write down is going to have to stand in some nexus to, well, the actual drawing of the conclusion, the doing. So Sellars is coming to the conclusion here that to understand how configurations of names can say something, we have to think about what we're doing in saying something. And he's going to understand that in terms of inferring, making a move, a language move. So if we have to put the lesson in a slogan, it's that ineffability is a sign that you're trying to do in your semantic theory what you should do in your pragmatic theory. That you're trying to put into your theory of content what needs to go into your account of the use of the expressions. And the fact that adding more statements to your semantics can't substitute for that invocation of something that you do rather than something you say. That's the lesson of the Lewis Carroll regress. Sellars is saying that's the lesson of the Bradley regress too, or at least that's the conclusion that we should draw from it. You can't understand the unity of the proposition without understanding what it is to use an expression, to say something. And that is, I will say, to use it as a premise or a conclusion of an inference, as the terminus of a move that you can make in the language game. And that's why the world isn't really written in jumblese, too. Because what makes those things into sayings is the use of them, and nobody's using them. So, I mean, we could, I could leave you a message by arranging objects, but I'd be doing it and you'd be making inferences from it, like the map inference. Now, this is dark, but I think it's deep. I think what he's after here goes really deep in understanding the notion of content, the notion of language. He's only got a slippery grip on it at the end of naming and saying, but he's really putting on the table all the considerations that we need. So we want to follow this strand in his later thought. Okay, now I did not get to talk about empiricism and abstract entities. That's not something that I want to do in a hurry next time or skip entirely. I'm going to move it a couple weeks. It's an early essay as far as what he doesn't develop his view there. It's so early that he's very unguarded in talking about his motivations, in particular for his hostility to abstract objects. So when we come back to look at that, I'll go through that, the material that I was thinking possibly to get to today, because we'll need all of next time to talk about alethic modal vocabulary as an instance of something quite different from the abstraction that he gives a metalinguistic account of. And of course, it's independently important anyway. It's modal discourse. So that's for next time.